The day I realized my neighbor had quietly taken 8 feet of my backyard. I stood there for a long minute just staring at a brand new fence that absolutely did not belong where it was. The strange part wasn't that someone built a fence. People build fences all the time. The strange part was that the fence was sitting deep inside my property, and the man who built it was acting like it had always been there. And the moment he shrugged and closed his front door in my face, that was the moment I decided something. If he wanted to pretend that strip of land wasn't mine anymore, then I was going to use it in a way he'd never forget. Now, to understand how this whole thing started, you need to picture the neighborhood. I live in a quiet part of Peoria, Illinois, in a neighborhood that was built sometime in the late 70s. Nothing fancy. It's just modest houses, wide streets, a lot of old trees. And the kind of place where people wave when they drive by, even if they don't know your name. I bought my house 11 years ago, back when I was newly divorced and trying to start over. It wasn't huge, but it had character. White siding, a small wooden porch out front, and the best part, a backyard that was wider than most on the block. The lot sat on a slight corner angle, so the back stretched farther than people expected. And for the entire time I lived there, the backyard had always been open. No fences, just grass and a row of old maple trees running along the back property line. Like a natural border someone planted decades ago. The previous owner, an older guy named Arthur, told me once while we were signing paperwork that he never liked fences. Fences make people think they're enemies, he'd said with a laugh. So the yard stayed open. My yard blended into the yard behind it. The maple trees marked the line, but nobody really thought about it. For 11 years, that worked perfectly. Kids from down the street sometimes chased baseballs across the grass. My dog used to run lazy circles out there in the evenings. In the fall, those maples turned bright red and covered everything in leaves. It felt peaceful. Then last spring, the house behind mine sold. The old owner had passed away, and about a month later, a young couple moved in. Late 20s, maybe. Early 30s at most. Their names were Mason and Chloe, and from the very first week, they were the renovation type. You know the kind. Within days, there were trucks outside their place every morning. Roofers, painters, landscapers. The house got new siding, a new roof, new windows, and what looked like about $20,000 worth of landscaping in the span of 2 weeks. At first I figured they were just excited first-time homeowners. I didn't blame them, but then the fence truck showed up. It was a big fencing company van pulling a trailer stacked with fresh cedar panels and metal brackets. I remember watching the crew unload everything while I was drinking coffee at my kitchen window. I didn't think much of it. Plenty of people want privacy fences. The crew worked all day. You could hear the rhythmic thud of post-hole diggers and power drills echoing down the street. By late afternoon, those tall wooden panels started going up one after another. And by sunset, a brand new privacy fence ran across the entire back section of Mason and Chloe's yard. Except something about it felt off. At first I couldn't explain it. It was just this quiet little feeling in the back of my mind as I stood on my porch looking toward the maple trees. The fence looked closer to my house than it should have been. Now perspective can play tricks on you. Angles change when new structures go up. So I brushed the thought aside that night. But the next morning, curiosity got the better of me. I walked out into the backyard with a tape measure. There was a specific spot I knew well, the corner maple tree. When I bought the house, the survey paperwork mentioned that tree because it sat almost exactly on the property line. According to the documents, the distance from my back porch corner to that tree should have been right around 30 feet. So I hooked the tape measure and walked it back toward the new fence. 22 feet. I measured again. 22 feet. I stood there staring at the numbers while the morning wind rustled the maple leaves above me. 8 feet, 8 feet. 8 feet of my yard was now sitting on the other side of their brand new fence. Now, maybe it was a mistake. Construction crews make mistakes. Stakes get moved. Measurements get misread. So I walked around to their front door and knocked. Mason answered. Tall guy, athletic build. The kind of person who always looks like he just finished a workout. I smiled and kept my tone friendly. Hey man, I said. I think there might be a little issue with that new fence in the back. He tilted his head slightly. What kind of issue? It looks like it might have been built a few feet inside my property line. He didn't look worried. He didn't even look curious. Instead, he leaned casually against the doorframe and said something that would end up shaping everything that came next. Our contractor followed the survey stakes. I nodded slowly. Okay, do you happen to have a copy of the survey? He shook his head. Not on me. Then he added with a quick shrug. But those guys know what they're doing. I glanced past him toward the hallway where I could hear Chloe moving around inside the house. Would you mind double-checking with them before they finish the last section? I asked. Just to be safe. He crossed his arms. Well, the job's already paid for. Another shrug, and honestly, the fence looks great where it is. That was the moment the conversation shifted. Not angry, not loud, just dismissive. Like the subject wasn't worth the effort. I stood there for another second, letting the silence stretch between us. Then I nodded. All right, I said calmly. I'll look into it. He gave a quick smile. Sounds good, and closed the door. I walked back to my yard, stood near the maple tree again, and looked at that fence, cutting across the grass like a line drawn by someone who assumed nobody would question it. That afternoon, I made a phone call. 2 days later, a professional land surveyor named Victor showed up with a tripod, measuring rods, and a clipboard thick with paperwork. And that's when things got very interesting. Victor showed up early that Wednesday morning in a dusty pickup truck that looked like it had been driving around property. Lines for the last 30 years. Gray beard, sunburned neck, ball cap that said Apex Survey Services. The kind of guy who didn't say much at first, but clearly knew exactly what he was doing. He stepped out, looked around the yard, and gave a slow nod. Nice lot, he said. Thanks, I replied. Hopefully still mine. He chuckled under his breath like he'd heard that sentence 1,000 times. Victor spent the next 3 hours walking every inch of the property. He set up his tripod, peered through measuring scopes, checked old markers buried in the soil, and referenced county records he had printed out on thick paper. While he worked, I mostly stayed out of the way, sitting on the porch with a cup of coffee and pretending not to watch every move he made. About halfway through the process, Mason stepped out onto his back deck. He leaned against the railing, arms crossed, staring down at Victor, like someone watching a mechanic work on a car they were sure didn't need fixing. Chloe joined him a minute later. She whispered something to him, and they both glanced over at me. Nobody waved. Nobody said anything. The tension was quiet, but it was there. Around late morning, Victor walked over toward me, wiping his hands on a rag. Well, he said, I've got your line. My stomach tightened a little, and he pointed toward the fence. You were right. Not close. Not a little. Right then, he grabbed a bundle of bright orange flags from the truck. Victor started placing them in the ground, one by one, moving in a straight line across the back of the yard. Every single flag landed several feet in front of the new fence. When he finished, the line of orange markers sat about 8 feet inside Mason and Chloe's enclosed yard. Victor stepped back, looked at the line, and nodded. Textbook, he said. I walked out there and just stood for a second, taking it in. 8 feet of my land completely sealed off behind their brand new fence. I asked Victor to send me the official survey documents. And before he left, I snapped about a dozen photos showing the flags lined up perfectly along the real property boundary. Then I emailed everything to Mason. Photos, survey, a short message. Hey Mason, I had the property surveyed today. Looks like the fence ended up about 8 feet inside my lot. Attached are the measurements. Let me know when you want to talk about moving it. That felt fair, professional, reasonable. 3 days passed. No response. 4 days? Nothing. A week later, I knocked on their door again. This time, Chloe answered. She looked slightly uncomfortable when she saw me. "Hey," she said. "Hi," I replied. "Is Mason around?" She hesitated for a moment, then called over her shoulder. "Mason, it's the neighbor." He walked into the hallway a few seconds later. Same casual expression. Same relaxed posture. I explained what the survey showed and asked if he'd had a chance to look at the email. "Oh yeah," he said. "That was it." Just, "Oh yeah." So I asked. He rubbed the back of his neck. "Look, man," he said, "moving that fence is going to cost a lot of money." I waited. He continued. "The company already finished the job. The posts are set in concrete and everything." Another pause. Then he delivered the sentence that honestly still makes me laugh when I think about it. "You still have plenty of yard." I blinked. "Are you seriously suggesting I give you 8 feet of my property?" He shrugged, like it was the most normal idea in the world. Fences end up a little off sometimes. That was the moment the conversation stopped being a misunderstanding. It became a choice, and he had just made his presage. I looked at him for a long second. He held the same indifferent expression. Then he gave a little half-smile and said, "Anyway, we're pretty busy right now." And he closed the door. Just like that. Now I'll admit something. For the rest of that afternoon, I was furious. Not yelling, furious. Not break something, furious. Just that slow, simmering kind of anger that sits quietly in your chest while your brain starts turning over possibilities. I walked out into the yard again and stared at the fence. On the other side of it, Mason's new landscaping was pristine. Fresh sod, stone edging, a brand new wooden deck attached to the back of their house. They'd spent a fortune making that yard look nice, and 8 feet of my grass was sitting right in the middle of it. That evening, I opened up the county property records online. I pulled up the parcel map, zoomed in, then zoomed in further, and there it was. That narrow strip of land behind their fence, still legally attached to my lot number. Which meant something important. The fence didn't change ownership. The land was still mine. And according to the local ordinances, the property owner had the right to install structures, landscaping, or improvements on their own land, even if access was inconvenient. I leaned back in my chair slowly. An idea started forming. At first, it was just a small thought. Then it started getting bigger. And funnier. And a little bit poetic. The next morning, I called a landscaping company. The owner's name was Hector. Great guy. Did a lot of work around our neighborhood. I explained the situation and asked him to come take a look. When he arrived that afternoon, we walked around the side of Mason's house, where the fence connected to the property line. Hector studied the orange survey flags still stuck in the ground. Then he looked at the fence panels sitting well behind them. He whistled. He said, "That's not even close." "Nope." He rubbed his chin. "So what are you thinking?" I pointed to the strip of land between the flags and the fence. "I want to install something here." He raised an eyebrow. "What kind of something?" "Planter boxes?" "Planter boxes." "Big ones." Hector smiled slowly. "How big?" 4 feet tall, I said, and running the entire length of the property line. Now he was starting to understand. "And what are we planting in them?" I looked back at the fence. "Bamboo." Hector burst out laughing. "Oh man," he said. "That's evil. Completely legal though. Very legal." We stood there for another moment, imagining it. A thick wall of fast-growing bamboo rising directly inside Mason's expensive backyard, blocking his view, stealing his sunlight. Right on top of land he had decided wasn't worth returning. Hector scratched his beard. "When do you want to start?" "Next week." So the following Monday morning, a landscaping truck pulled up in front of my house. with a small excavator on a trailer and a bed full of lumber and steel posts. I stepped outside with a cup of coffee just as Hector and his crew started unloading equipment. And right on schedule, Mason walked out onto his deck. He leaned over the railing, looking confused. Chloe joined him a moment later. From where I stood, I could see both of their faces slowly trying to figure out what was happening. Hector's crew carried the first steel post into the backyard. Then the excavator started digging holes. But not in my yard. Inside the fence. Directly in the strip of land that technically belonged to me. I could practically feel Mason's brain trying to process the situation from 30 feet away. It took him about 2 minutes before he finally walked down the deck stairs and headed toward the fence gate. He stepped into the yard where Hector's crew was working. "What's going on?" he asked. Hector looked up calmly. "You'll have to ask the property owner." Mason turned toward me. I walked over slowly. "We're installing some posts," I said. "For what?" "Structure on my property." He pointed at the fence behind him. "That's my yard." I pointed at the orange survey flag still lined across the grass. "That's my land." For the first time since this whole thing started, Mason didn't have a quick answer. He just stood there, staring at the flags, then at the holes being dug along the line. And suddenly, the reality of the situation began settling in. The land he had claimed as part of his backyard was about to become something very different. Mason stood there for a few seconds, watching Hector's crew work, and I could see the gears turning in his head. The excavator had already dug 3 holes, each about 2 feet wide and deep enough that you couldn't see the bottom from where we stood. One of the guys was lowering a thick steel post into the first one, while another guy mixed concrete in a wheelbarrow. Mason finally looked back at me. "You can't just build stuff in my yard," he said. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't get sarcastic. I just pointed again at the line of bright orange flags. "It's not your yard." He glanced at them again. And I could see that moment when someone realizes they might have pushed a situation a little too far, but they're not quite ready to admit it yet. Chloe had walked down from the deck by then. She stood a few steps behind him, arms folded, watching the whole thing with that tight expression people get when they're trying to stay polite, but the stress is starting to leak out. "What exactly are you building?" she asked. "Planters," I said. Mason frowned. "Planters?" "Yep." Hector looked up from the hole he was checking and added helpfully. "Large ones." The crew continued working like the conversation wasn't even happening. Post number 1 went in. Concrete poured. Then post number 2. Then 3. Mason watched every second of it. Eventually, he sighed and shook his head. "This is ridiculous," he muttered. Then he turned and walked back toward his house. But the work didn't stop. For the next few minutes, he was in a state of panic. The next 2 days, Hector's crew installed 12 heavy steel posts in a perfectly straight line along the survey markers. Each one was sunk deep into concrete, so they weren't going anywhere. By the end of the second day, the posts formed a long frame stretching across the entire 8-foot strip of land. That's when the wooden planter boxes went in. They were solid things. Thick cedar boards, reinforced corners, 4 feet tall and nearly 3 feet wide. When they were finished and filled with soil, they looked less like garden boxes and more like a raised wall running across the property line. Mason came outside again, while the crew was filling the last box with soil. He didn't say anything this time. He just watched. Hector planted the bamboo that afternoon. Fast-growing, clumping bamboo, the kind landscapers use when someone wants instant privacy. At first, it didn't look like much. Clusters of green stalks about 4 or 5 feet tall, with thin leaves fluttering in the breeze. Mason stood on his deck again while it was happening. The whole scene probably looked confusing at that stage. A row of planters, some plants, nothing dramatic. But bamboo grows fast, really fast. And over the next few weeks, those plants began doing exactly what bamboo does best. They shot upward. New stalks appeared almost overnight. The leaves thickened. The green wall became denser, day by day. By the middle of the summer, the bamboo was already pushing 7 feet tall. By August, it had passed 8. From my yard, it looked beautiful. A lush, swaying screen of green that rustled softly whenever the wind passed through. From Mason's deck, it looked like a jungle wall sitting about 6 feet away from his patio furniture. The change to his backyard happened gradually. But once you noticed it, you couldn't unsee it. The sunlight that used to reach his deck in the afternoon started disappearing earlier and earlier. The fancy landscaping he'd installed along the fence line ended up in permanent shade. His once wide-open view across the yards behind us had been replaced with a dense wall of bamboo leaves. Sometimes when I sat on my porch in the evenings, I could hear them talking out there, not shouting, just frustrated conversations drifting through the air. At one point, I heard Mason say, "This is insane." Chloe replied quietly, "Well, we did build the fence." That comment hung in the air for a long time. About 3 weeks after the bamboo reached full height, Mason knocked on my door. I had a feeling that moment was coming. When I opened the door, he looked different than the last time we'd spoken. Less confident, more tired. "Hey," he said. "Hey." He shifted his weight awkwardly. "Can we talk for a minute?" We stepped out onto the porch. He glanced toward the backyard like the bamboo might somehow hear him. "That stuff you planted," he said. "It's kind of ruining the yard." I nodded slowly. "It's on my land." "I know," he said quickly. He ran a hand through his hair. "But it's blocking all the sun. The deck barely gets any light now." I didn't say anything. He continued. "And the plants we put in along the fence are dying." I leaned against the porch railing. "That sounds frustrating." He looked at me for a second, probably trying to figure out whether I was being sarcastic. Then he sighed again. "Look," he said, "would you consider taking the planters out?" There it was. The question we both knew would eventually arrive. I let the silence stretch just long enough to make the moment uncomfortable. Then I said calmly, "Maybe." His eyes lifted slightly. "Really?" "Sure," I said. "If the fence moves," he stared at me. "You mean back to the survey line?" "Exactly." Another long pause. He looked out toward the backyard again, probably imagining the cost, the hassle, the call to the fence company. Finally, he nodded. "Okay," he said quietly. 2 weeks later, the same fencing company returned. I happened to be in the kitchen when their truck pulled up. I walked outside with my coffee and leaned on the porch railing as the crew started dismantling the fence panel by panel. The posts that had once been sunk proudly into Mason's new yard were pulled out of the ground one after another. Concrete cracked, wood lifted. The fence slowly crept backward until it reached the exact line where Victor's orange flags had once stood. It took them almost a full day. By the time they finished, the new fence sat perfectly on the property boundary, exactly where it should have been in the first place. The next morning, Hector came back with his crew. Removing the planters was a lot faster than installing them. They emptied the soil, lifted the boxes onto the truck, and carefully dug up the bamboo clusters to replant somewhere else. Within a few hours, the 8-foot strip of land was open again. Sunlight poured across Mason's deck. The shadow disappeared, and my backyard quietly gained back 8 feet of grass that had never stopped belonging to me. Mason and I still live next to each other. We wave sometimes when we're both outside. We're polite, but we're not friends. And every once in a while, when I mow the lawn, I reach the edge of that property line, and I can't help glancing at the fence. Perfectly straight, perfectly placed. Exactly 8 feet farther back than where it used to be. Now, here's the part I'm curious about. Some of my friends say what I did was justified. That if someone tries to take advantage of you like that, they deserve whatever consequences come their way. Others say the bamboo wall was petty, that I should have handled it differently. So I'm honestly curious what you think. If someone built a fence 8 feet into your property and then shrugged it off like it didn't matter, what would you have done? Would you have fought it the same way? Or would you have taken a different route? Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe to Caring Conflict for more. See you next time.